everyone, we're going to install this Gen 3 harness on our test motor to run it. We test run every engine or every harness that we ship. Mitch and Jory are going to install it and we're going to start this motor up. This is the main LS harness. It's a factory GM harness. You'll see it has all the hardware, clips, mounts that GM includes on their production engines. This small sub harness over here is the rear emissions and O2, and this is actually how GM does it. This breaks off the chassis, and we're using the original GM breakout connectors. This is where you want to start, right on top of the intake. You'll see that the proper hardware is there to mount this harness. This Y, one leg goes back to the transmission, one leg goes back to the back of the engine, and the third leg comes off to the computer. This is pretty much our standard ECM mount location with Busman. We do have some options if you have an S-Pod or an air compressor. What Mitch is showing you right now is our 28-pin interior connector. This is going to go through the firewall. It's a spiral lock connector, weatherproof. They've moved pretty quick, but this trunk here comes down, and don't run these near exhaust. Don't run it to the outside of the alternator. Run this trunk down inside of the alternator next to the air compressor. That's going to split off into two sides. One side's going to go back and do the knock sensor on the driver. The other side's going to go back and do the knock sensor on the passenger, the starter motor, and the crank sensor. And these are all factory connectors. We're using the factory starter wiring and air conditioning wiring. Mitch is connecting the purge valve right now, which isn't actually functional on this test engine because this is a 08 engine, so it has a different map sensor. So we had to put an 09 map sensor on it to make it work with the calibrations we run. Pretty much 9 and up run very similar calibrations. 7 and 8 were oddball. So you can see that we have the map sensor plugged into the purge valve here. You want to run it with your air intake tube on because this contains a MAF sensor, which is very important in the GM operating system. Now you'll see this long MAF sensor connector, and that's how GM does it on their trucks. They run it along the firewall, up the fender, and then into the MAF sensor, which makes some sense because you're not running it across the motor and exposing it to heat. You can shorten this if you choose to, but we leave it the way GM designed it. Joey has already installed the oil pressure sensor and the AFM connector. Now this AFM connector needs to be plugged in whether you're running AFM or not. And the reason for that is the solenoids need to be grounded in order to stay in the V8 mode. So make sure if you have AFM, even if you don't intend to run it, you plug that connector in. Mitch is plugging in the starter motor, crank sensor, and that's behind the crank sensor is behind the starter motor. It's a little difficult to get to. Joey's plugging in the coils on the passenger side, throttle body. Be careful with your injectors. They do pretty much lay out so that you can only plug them in one way, but if you try real hard you can plug them in backwards. You don't want to swap injector 1 to injector 7. If you have any questions, just go ahead and look at your manual. Alright, I think we're ready to start it. Now while this is running, we'll actually hook a scanner up and we'll check for codes. We have the TCM, that's the transmission module, plugged in. And of course the ECM. We'll also plug in the BCM and we'll scan the whole network. If there's any issues with this harness, any codes, we want to identify it before we ship it out. So that's how easy it is to install this harness. I hope this helps.